The end-of-quarter celebration had stretched late into the night, and the rooftop bar buzzed with the kind of reckless cheer only corporate victories could summon. Glasses clinked, voices rose, and laughter spilled over the skyline. Amid it all, Daniel Cole, the man everyone in the firm admired, sat hunched over his whiskey, a far cry from the commanding presence he carried in the boardroom. I had worked under Daniel for 3 years, long enough to learn that he was the type who never lost control. He was the boss who arrived first, left last, and carried the entire team's weight on his shoulders without complaint. At 42, he was both intimidating and magnetic. Sharp jawline, salt and pepper hair, the kind of charisma that turned heads when he entered a room. He was also married, a father of 2, and the figure I had quietly admired from the safety of distance. I was Ethan Brooks, 28, ambitious, and careful. My co-workers knew me as reliable, diligent, and maybe a little too reserved. What they didn't know, what I never allowed to slip, was the secret current of attraction I carried for the man across the table. It was easier to bury than to acknowledge. Safer. Cleaner. But that night, Daniel was not the man I knew. His tie was crooked, his words slurred, and his hand gripped the rim of his glass as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. The others found it amusing, some even took out their phones to record his ramblings, but something in me recoiled at their mockery. When the crowd began thinning, leaving him half asleep on a bar stool, I knew what I had to do. "I'll get him home," I said firmly, ignoring the smirks that flickered between colleagues. It wasn't the first time I'd played caretaker, but this was different. The thought of being alone with him tightened my chest with anticipation and dread. I helped him to his feet, his weight heavier than I expected, his arms slung across my shoulder. The smell of whiskey lingered on his breath, but beneath it was the faint scent of cedarwood cologne, one I had caught in elevators and conference rooms countless times, but never this close. The ride back to his apartment was quiet, save for his uneven breathing. Once, he leaned his head against the window, murmuring something I couldn't make out. I kept my eyes on the road, gripping the wheel tightly, forcing my thoughts into silence. When we arrived, I guided him out of the car and into the building. His hand brushed mine more than once, small accidental touches that sent jolts through me. In the elevator, he leaned against the mirrored wall, his reflection as disheveled as I had ever seen him. He chuckled softly to himself, then looked at me with eyes that, despite the haze, carried a flicker of recognition. "You're a good man, Ethan," he muttered, words heavy with drunken sincerity. My throat tightened. I wanted to reply, but the ding of the elevator interrupted, and soon we were at his door. Inside, the apartment greeted me with a warmth that was almost suffocating. Framed photographs lined the walls, Daniel with his wife, a smiling woman with kind eyes, and 2 children with his same sharp features. The life of a family man surrounded me, a reminder of boundaries I had no business crossing. I helped him onto the couch, setting a glass of water on the coffee table. He sank into the cushions, one arm draped over the side, his gaze distant. For a moment, I thought he was about to drift into sleep. But then, he turned his head, eyes locking onto mine with startling clarity. "Do you ever think about us?" he whispered. The words stopped me cold. My first instinct was denial. Surely I had misheard. Surely this was the whiskey talking. But his expression was earnest, stripped of all pretense. My pulse hammered in my ears, my mind racing with possibilities I had never dared to imagine. "Because I do," he added, softer this time, almost like a confession. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Every rational part of me screamed to leave, to close the door behind me and pretend none of this had ever happened. Yet I stood frozen, caught between fear and the undeniable truth of my own longing. And in that suspended moment, I realized nothing between us would ever be the same again. The next morning, I convinced myself it had been nothing more than the slurred ramblings of a drunk man. A slip of the tongue, a fragment of thoughtless desire drowned in whiskey. It was easier to believe that than to confront what Daniel had whispered. Yet when I walked into the office, coffee in hand and nerves wound tight, the weight of his words shadowed every step I took. Daniel avoided me all morning. He buried himself in meetings, phone calls, and reports, his expression guarded, his voice clipped. It was as if the night before had never happened. Still, when our eyes met across the glass walls of the conference room, something unspoken lingered between us. A hesitation. a question neither of us dared voice. By late evening, when the office had emptied and silence stretched over the rows of abandoned desks, he appeared at my door. He didn't knock, just stepped inside and closed it softly behind him. I looked up, startled, but the expression on his face silenced any words I might have mustered. He looked torn apart, as though wrestling with a decision that had already consumed him. "I meant what I said," Daniel confessed quietly. The air shifted. My heart lurched, and I set my pen down, hands trembling against the desk. He moved closer, leaning against the edge, eyes fixed on me as if daring me to challenge him. "I can't explain it," he continued, voice low, "but it wasn't the alcohol talking. I've thought about you for longer than I should admit. I know it's wrong, Ethan. I know what's at stake. But pretending otherwise is eating me alive." Hearing his confession aloud was both exhilarating and terrifying. Every part of me screamed to draw a line, to protect myself from the inevitable consequences. Yet the vulnerability in his tone dismantled my defenses. This wasn't the polished, untouchable Daniel Cole I'd known for years. This was a man stripped bare, reaching out for something he didn't dare ask for. I stood slowly, uncertain of my own strength, and in the charged stillness of that office, we crossed the line. Our lips met, tentative at first, then with the urgency of two men who had buried the truth for far too long. The kiss was brief, stolen, yet it carried the weight of every suppressed glance, every unspoken desire. When we pulled apart, guilt clawed its way into the space between us. Daniel ran a hand over his face, his breath uneven. "This can't happen again," he whispered. But the way his eyes lingered told me he already knew it would. And it did. The days that followed blurred into nights of secrecy. We met under the veil of darkness, sometimes in the anonymity of hotel rooms, other times in the quiet corners of the city where no one would recognize us. Each encounter was reckless, yet magnetic, drawing us deeper into a bond neither of us could resist. Daniel confided in me like never before, sharing the suffocating truth of a marriage that looked perfect on the outside but was fraying within. He spoke of loneliness, of expectations that weighed him down, of a life built on duty rather than passion. I listened, torn between sympathy and guilt. His family's photos still haunted me whenever I entered his apartment, their smiles a reminder of the betrayal woven into our intimacy. And yet, when he touched me, when his lips traced promises against my skin, every doubt melted into desire. But desire has a way of demanding more. What began as stolen hours soon grew into something heavier, an emotional tether that neither of us could deny. Daniel would text me during board meetings, simple words like "thinking of you" or "wish you were here." At night, when he lay beside his wife, he would call me just to hear my voice. I should have ended it. I should have pulled away before the web tightened. But instead, I let myself believe in the illusion that maybe what we had was not betrayal, but salvation. That I wasn't just a secret, but someone who mattered. One evening, after another hidden rendezvous, he held me longer than usual, his face buried in my shoulder. His voice broke as he whispered, "I've never felt this with anyone. Not even her." The weight of his words pressed into me, carving both hope and fear into my chest. For the first time, I realized this wasn't simply lust or longing, it was love. Dangerous, fragile, and entirely unsustainable. And as I drove home that night, his words replayed in my head, louder with every turn of the wheel. I knew then that what had begun as a spark of temptation had become something far more perilous, something that would demand a reckoning neither of us could escape. Rumors began before either of us admitted it out loud. A raised eyebrow from a colleague, a whisper in the corridor, a lingering glance when Daniel and I returned from lunch together. The office thrived on speculation, and though no one could prove anything, I felt the scrutiny pressing in. Every time Daniel leaned a little too close or lingered at my desk too long, I feared the walls would collapse. At home, the pressure was worse for him. His wife's calls grew more frequent, her voice sharp with suspicion. One evening, while we lay tangled in the muted glow of a hotel lamp, his phone buzzed again and again on the nightstand. He silenced it, jaw tight, but I could see the fracture widening. "This is breaking me," Daniel admitted, staring at the ceiling. "I can't keep living two lives." His words ignited both hope and dread. Hope that he might choose me, dread of the cost that choice would demand. I wanted to believe our love was worth the risk, but beneath that longing lurked guilt, sharp and relentless. His wife's face in those framed photos haunted me, her kindness undeserving of betrayal. And yet, when he reached for my hand, I couldn't pull away. Eventually, the confrontation arrived. One late night at the office, Daniel closed the door behind us, his expression weary, hollowed by weeks of secrecy. "I need to decide," he said, his voice trembling. "Her, or you." The silence that followed was unbearable. I wanted to beg him, to say the words that would tip the scale in my favor, but I stayed quiet. It wasn't my family at stake, it was his. When he finally spoke again, his confession was raw. "She knows something's wrong. She hasn't caught us, but she feels it. I see it in her eyes every morning. I hate myself for what I'm doing to her, but I can't let you go either." I felt the room shrink around us. The affair had been intoxicating, but here, under the harsh light of reality, it revealed its cost. Infidelity was no longer abstract, it was flesh and blood, tears and betrayal, and it was coming for us. The breaking point came not with discovery, but with his own collapse. A week later, he arrived at my apartment, eyes red, voice hoarse. He sat on my couch, shoulders shaking as he whispered the truth. "I told her," he said. "Not everything, but enough." I sat frozen, the weight of those words sinking in. His marriage was no longer intact, the damage had been done. And though part of me wanted to rejoice, the reality was far from romantic. His children, his reputation, his entire life had been upended by what we shared. He looked at me then, eyes brimming with desperation. "I don't know what happens next. All I know is that I love you." The words hit me like a tidal wave, everything I had longed to hear, yet everything I feared. Love, yes. But love born in secrecy, carved from betrayal, was jagged and uncertain. I pulled him into my arms, feeling his body tremble against mine. For the first time, I saw him not as the unshakable leader, nor the secret lover, but as a man unraveling under the weight of choices that could not be undone. That night, after he left, I sat alone with the silence. His declaration echoed in my mind, sweet and poisonous all at once. I realized there was no neat ending to what we had begun. Whether he chose me fully or tried to mend what was broken at home, scars would remain. And mine would be among them. As dawn crept through the blinds, I understood the truth that had lingered in the shadows all along. Infidelity was not just about betrayal, it was about collision. Desire against duty. Love against loyalty. And in that collision, no one walked away untouched. I don't know what the future holds for Daniel and me. Perhaps he will rebuild with her, or perhaps he will build anew with me. But either way, the night he whispered, "Do you ever think about us?" will forever mark the moment both our lives changed irreversibly. And for me, there is no going back. In the days that followed Daniel's confession to his wife, silence stretched between us like a taut rope ready to snap. He didn't call, didn't text, and for the first time in months, my phone lay idle at night. I told myself it was for the best, that he needed to untangle the mess of his home before we could even think about us. But every hour without him felt like a wound reopening. At work, Daniel carried himself with grim composure. Meetings went on, projects advanced, and from a distance he seemed unchanged. Yet I saw the cracks, the way his hand lingered on his temple during briefings, the faint redness in his eyes, the hollow set of his jaw. No one else noticed, but I did. I always did. When he finally came to me, it wasn't with the warmth I'd been craving. He closed my office door, exhaled heavily, and lowered himself into the chair across from me. "She knows enough," he said, his voice ragged. "She doesn't have proof, but she doesn't need it. I broke her trust. She's shattered, Ethan." His words sank into me, heavy and sharp. I wanted to reach across the desk, to take his hand, but the distance between us felt insurmountable. "What does this mean for you two?" I asked cautiously. He hesitated, eyes fixed on the carpet. "I don't know. She hasn't asked me to leave. Maybe she's hoping I'll fight for us. But part of me wonders if I even can anymore." The admission stung more than I expected. Here I was, hoping he'd choose me, yet the very thought of him staying with her tightened something bitter in my chest. Still, I couldn't bring myself to demand an answer. Not yet. That night, when we finally found ourselves alone, the air between us was thick with uncertainty. We touched each other with a desperation that felt less like passion and more like clinging to the last fragments of something fragile. Afterward, he lay in silence, staring at the ceiling, while I searched his face for clues to a future neither of us could name. "I love you," he whispered finally, voice breaking. "But love doesn't erase the damage I've done. To her. To the kids. To you." I turned to him, my chest aching. "Then what do we do?" He didn't answer. Days slipped into weeks, and our lives became a balancing act between secrecy and exposure. At work, we were professionals, distant, composed, unremarkable. Behind closed doors, we were something else entirely. Raw, vulnerable, and increasingly entangled. Yet the more I fell, the more I feared. Was I building a future with a man who still had one foot in the past? The strain began to show. I grew impatient with his silences, resentful of the nights he went home to her instead of staying with me. He, in turn, grew restless, consumed by guilt and obligation. Our stolen moments, once thrilling, now carried a weight that threatened to crush us both. One evening, after a tense silence over dinner in my apartment, I finally asked the question that had been gnawing at me. "Daniel, do you see us lasting? Or are we just a chapter you'll regret someday?" He looked up sharply, pain flickering in his eyes. For a moment, I thought he would lash out, but instead, his shoulders slumped. "I don't regret you," he said quietly. "I regret the lies, the hurt. But you. Never." His words soothed and cut all at once. Love without a future was still love, but was it enough? As he left that night, pausing at the door as though he wanted to say more, I realized we were standing at the edge of something neither of us controlled. Whether we would leap together or fall apart, I couldn't yet tell. But one truth was undeniable. The moment I took him home that night, our lives became entwined in a story neither of us could escape. And the ending, whatever shape it took, would demand everything from us both.